Hello, everyone. Welcome to Critical Faculty. I'm your host, Hani Salim. Today, we are going to be revisiting an old issue, an old but new, because it's always with us. It never goes away, and it's the problem of suffering. And I've got two gentlemen with me today in the studio who are written extensively about this issue, and I've got many thoughts to share with us today. They're friends of the channel, and they're friends of mine. We're talking about two people who can actually combine intelligence and kindness at the same time. I'm very honored to be friends with them. Uh, Hello, Dan, and hello, Jonathan. How are you?
Good, whatever it is, morning, evening, afternoon.
Morning, my time, 2 o'clock in the
Hello,
morning.
hello, the world. Australia, 2 in the morning. Here, sometime in the afternoon, and Dan's just got up. So happy days. We are a global phenomenon.
I'm in Wisconsin.
Should I
Yeah.
congratulate you for that, or is that a good thing?
Well, today, yes, because this is the first snow of the season, and the first snow is always very pretty and fun. But after the 10th and 20th snow, but this is the beginning of it, so this is nice.
This is the law of diminishing returns.
Is that it? Yeah.
Economically speaking, it's like the first glass of water you have in a desert is glorious.
Yeah.
The 20th, you're like, yeah, my stomach's exploding now. There you go.
Wisconsin's always sort of attached to the 70s show, that 70s show. Hello, Wisconsin. It's always in the pros. It's got fun memories. Well, some suffering is self-inflicted. I'm here up in 2 o'clock in the morning to do this. So maybe suffering isn't that bad after all, because it's been argued. I mean, and we're going to go into the arguments and the theodicies which have been created, which means the justice of God in Greek, to explain away the problem, that there isn't a problem whatsoever. But let's delve into the history of it. Did it start with religion? Was it a little bit as a precursor to it, and then was highly manifested in the realm of religion, and especially the one who's got the all maximal attributes, aka the Abrahamic God? And we'll start with Jonathan.
Well, I to be honest, I haven't looked historically into this hugely, but I would say that it's worth thinking about how do humans feel about things like justice, things like morality, and then we can talk about evolutionary history. We can look at other species like the work of, say, Franz de Waal has done with capuchin monkeys to show that capuchin monkeys have a very strong inherent sense of justice. And when they see one capuchin they're both given tokens that they can get food basically if they eat, or I think they get given tokens, and if they collect tokens or something like that, they either get given a grape or a cucumber, and they expect grapes. And when one's given grape and the other one's given cucumber, the one that's given cucumber because they don't like cucumber gets really mad and goes nuts and say, as if to say, hey, that's not fair. How come he gets a grape and I get a cucumber? And so there's been really interesting work around that to show that this species feels justice. Okay, so we feel justice, then this permeates throughout the natural world to some degree and to different degrees. But with the great apes, that seems to be to a greater degree. And then we look at humanity, where we have the ability to talk and cogitate and think about these things and express our ideas, and then express that actually I didn't like that wasn't great, that happening to me, but that's happened to you, that's good, and we start talking in terms of having moral discussions. And then I put that together with something called the just world theory. So the just world theory is something that everyone has, and you can talk about this before God existing or being created by humanity. But you have this now. I wrote a piece some time ago about my partner expressing that our oven door got smashed by our twin boys, and it was like terrible. It was going to cost us £1,500 to replace it because it's a big old oven. And she was like, oh, it must have happened for a reason. We were going to die from carbon monoxide poisoning like over the next week. So maybe, and it's like, even though she didn't believe in God, she created this scenario whereby the world can't be unfair, so that had to happen for a reason. So the fairness of that happening was in terms of we were going to possibly die from carbon. I mean, she completely made it up. But the point is that we all have this sense of there being a just world, even though the world isn't just. And you take all that into account, and then you can understand why God might be invented, or at least molded to fit this idea of allowing us to have justice ultimately over time. And that is a quick run through a whole bunch of different things, and there's a lot more to be said on it, but those would be my initial thoughts.
So one for Dan here. Do you think, Dan, then we're talking about the human brain evolving, and there is a start to draw a distinction between a situation that is fair or not fair, and that's obviously we're talking about intentionality here, because there must have been an intention behind everything that happens, and humanity or whatever animal that is have a developed brain to be able to draw the distinction between comparative situations of one that is happening that is favorable and another that it's not, and then the conception of the word justice.
Well, yeah, I think this is relevant if to avoid the risk of conflating the problem of how do you be good without God or morality, and then the problem of evil or suffering. I think it's relevant if we make the assumption that somehow the mind of God is analogous to the minds of humans. If we think of God as an extension of a human mind, which it probably is, as we have created a God. If we think of it in that sense, then of course we can make some analogies about our justice and God's justice, if there is such a thing. But this also boils down to another assumption that, and which I used to believe, obviously, and I think most theists believe, is that God is good, that God can explain himself, that he's not this evil SOB that's playing games with the world. You know what I mean? So the theodicies all have to come down to a defense of the goodness of this creator, big boss, dictator in the sky, who, even though we are just young little organisms who can't understand it all, he has this great wisdom, and he can put all the pieces together to make what seems to us immoral or evil or suffering makes it seem to us actually in his big mind it all fits together. So that's kind of the puzzle task that these theists have to play in order to make their God, as John just said, this omni God, be a coherent concept. So, you know, I'm conversant with the problem of suffering and evil to some degree. I'm not a great world expert on it. I've done a lot of debates on it. I debated Dr. Rubel Shelley at Vanderbilt University. He's with the Church of Christ. We had a 2-night debate. In fact, the second night was in his church with 1,500 people there, the day after Columbine happened. And so there were armed police officers in the church building thinking, oh no, an atheist is coming to town and there's all these young people. So they were imagining that somehow there was going to be a big riot because an atheist was arguing. And nothing happened, except the only thing that happened was I had some books under a table in the back lobby that I was going to sell afterwards. Somebody stole it. Even though the police were there and everything, somebody stole my box.
But you know what? It's if I was a Christian, I'd be saying these things happen for a greater good, though, Dan. Which is to say that these Christians are now reading all these atheistic books and will be deconverting.
Yeah,
so
I know it. I can't. I don't know what happened. I'm just imagining that somebody said, "No, we're not putting these books in our church lobby." But anyway, Dr. Shelley brought up a number of theodicies. And historically, there's John Hicks's idea of character building, that these things happen to us so that our character can be built, which is pretty easy to shoot down. We can talk about that later if you want to. Of course, another big one is mystery. Like, I think we all would agree that we shouldn't take a needle and jab it into a baby, right? Unless that baby needs a life-saving injection. Then we adults and doctors and nurses will take a needle and we will poke it into a baby, and the baby will feel pain, and the baby's going to cry. The baby's not going to like it. The baby's going to wonder, why are you hurting me? Well, those of us who know more than the baby understand that there has to be a minimal amount of temporary suffering in order for a greater good. When the baby grows up, we can explain to that baby, sorry, we had to hurt you. We had to do something you didn't like, but it was for a greater good. So a lot of theists imagine that's the way God is. We are just these little baby creatures who have a limited understanding of why we're hurting. But in the big picture, God's going to come along someday and tell us, here's why I had to do that to you. I'm sorry, but it was for the greater good. So there's a number of these theodicies that put together. And in a few minutes, I want to talk about an article I wrote for John Loftus' book, and when I talked about the horrible thing that happened in Lisbon some years ago. But basically, that's sort of my general overview. I also wrote a book about morality called Mere Morality,
Excellent.
where I talk. John was alluding to a lot of these things too, about how morality can be explained in a naturalistic way, in a basic biological way. Really, I think a lot of our natural moral impulses are biological. We inherited them. Some of them are social. We call that law or social expectation. But most of them are rational. Most of them are our brains thinking through whatever your moral philosophy happens to be, explicit or not. We use our brains to kind of situationally decide what path should I take here to either create the greatest amount of good, which I don't know if that's even possible to know, or to avoid as much pain and suffering as possible.
Can I just say it is a great book, Mere Morality, and well worth reading. I actually listened to it, and I listened to it and got great pleasure because it was Dan reading it himself, so that was particularly great. But what I loved about that book as well is the way that Dan talks towards the latter half of the book about how the Bible isn't really this great compendium of moral teaching. In fact, what the Bible appears to be is like, this is how you should be submissive to God, and it's about your relationship with God rather than your relationship with other human beings. And I know this isn't necessarily to the problem of evil, but I think it's a really important point that actually, if you're looking to the Bible as a guidance for how you should behave, it doesn't really give you all that much. It tells you how you should behave vis-a-vis you and God, but not how to behave vis-a-vis you and the rest of humanity, which to me is kind of like, that's actually our daily grind, and that's how we should be taught how best to behave with each other to minimize evil and suffering.
Can I
there's a big go ahead,
Dan.
Dan.
Qualify that just briefly. There are a few passages in the Bible that talk about human to human. I did a survey of all of the passages that deal with the words evil and wicked in the Bible, and about 5% of the time you'll see things like avoiding drunkenness or treating other human beings with justice, and those are the verses that the theists like to quote because but about 95% of the time, you're right, John, it has nothing to do with how we treat each other. It all has to do with kissing God's feet. You know what I mean? It all has to do with pleasing this angry, jealous God. Obedience basically is what morality boils down to in most of the Bible.
I think morality and the problem of suffering or evil, there is a bit of a connection, because we're going to have to at some point define what's evil, because it's a common word between morality, because you're trying to avoid what's evil doing to others, so therefore I think there's a bit of a connection. But if we go back to the first portraits of this problem, and I think the first proper recorded portrait of the problem of suffering was Epicurus. But I can conceive of a caveman coming out, a Homo sapiens, some 50,000 or 60,000 years ago, out of a cave just to stump their toe on a rock, and the emergence of the F word for the first time. So I think we might have known about this problem way before God's, but to articulate and to talk about it, we needed a certain candidate for that God who has certain attributes. And Epicurus, I think, captured the essence of this problem quite nicely. You can tell us, Jonathan, about that.
Well, I think, did he not use it as an argument against the existence of God because of evil, and that's hence we get, it's worth mentioning that there are generally thought of as two formulations of the problem of evil. You've got the logical problem of evil, which attempts to say God does not exist if evil exists, and it might look something like this. Let's see if I can find a version of it. If God exists, this is taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. If God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. So this goes back to what Dan was talking about, omni-God. I call that omni-God, which is in something called perfect being theology. It's the idea that God must have these great making properties, as they are called. So if God is omnipotent, then has the power to eliminate all evil. And this is kind of based on Epicurus's approach. If God is omniscient, then he knows when evil exists. If God is morally perfect, then God has the desire to eliminate all evil. Evil exists. If evil exists and God exists, then either God doesn't have the power to eliminate all evil, or doesn't know when evil exists, or doesn't have the desire to eliminate all evil. Therefore, God doesn't exist. So basically, with that, you're either saying God doesn't exist, or you're qualifying God. Say, well, God is an omni-God, so God just doesn't know what to do about it, or doesn't have the power to do something about it, or you know, or isn't caring enough to kind of want to do something about it. So that's a logic.
But it doesn't remove the existence of a creator. But maybe the word God here, because we're talking about worship worthy.
Yeah, so as I say, it just goes from being omni-God to being less than omni-God, right? So it doesn't necessarily get rid of evil, but if your idea of if your definition of God is omni-God, then omni-God doesn't exist. That would be what that would lead you toward. However, theists come back and say, well, actually, there could be suffering that serves some kind of function that brings about a greater good, and is even necessary for a greater good. In the same way that Dan talked about an injection for a child or for any human, it's this idea that it brings about a greater good. You get interesting conversations here to say that actually that's using something called consequentialist morality. So you could charge that God is a consequentialist. Now, theists don't like this because it means that God is not necessary for morality, because if morality is derived by the consequences of any given action, then we can have consequentialism without God. We can work out our moral kind of framework without invoking God. So theists don't like consequentialism. Yet, I mean, I've written a chapter in one of my books on this, that God appears to be very much a consequentialist if he's using this idea that evil is necessary for bringing about a greater good.
Yeah.
So lots of conversation to be had around that.
Quite interesting that Epicurus is talking about this omni-God, because this is the Greek era where gods weren't necessarily omni of anything. These were quite promiscuous gods. You know, they used to come down from heaven and rape humans, and you end up with demigods and half human, half man sort of thing. So he might be talking about something else, or something like his perception of a god away from the Greek gods. And it seems that the evolution of God himself have seen God being promoted from just very powerful and can do what the hell they want, and then suddenly becoming that singular entity that encapsulates the essence of goodness, and therefore is able to do a lot of things. Can Dan tell us what are the paradoxes that emerge from all these maximally attributes?
Yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of them, and John does a good job in one of his books of exploding what does he call it? Like ferrets in a bag. They're fighting with each other. There we go. 30 arguments
against the existence of God.
Yeah.
Heaven, Hell, and Divine Design. Heaven, Hell, Satan, Divine Design, with a foreword by Dan Barker. So sorry, I just thought I'd throw
the foreword's the best part of the book, I think. It's
obviously, Dan, obviously.
No, really, and it does raise a lot of problems. And it's not just evil. There's other ways that you can show, you know, like omniscience. But I want to back up and ask, why do we assume in this construction of this perfect being, perfect omni being, why do we assume that perfectly good is better than perfectly evil? There might be a perfectly evil God, which would fulfill the requirement of being an omni-God. Why are we giving weight to good over evil, except that the fact that we biological organisms, we don't like hurting. So we assume, well, God doesn't like hurting either. So there's sort of an assumption built into this omnibenevolence that somehow God has to be benevolent. And that's what I talk about in the chapter of my book, a chapter in John's book, John Loftus's book. I call it supernatural evil. There might be natural evil, there might be moral evil, but I think there's a third category that we overlook. And that is that there could be these natural evils, the earthquakes and tsunamis and all of that stuff could actually be expressions of a perfectly supernaturally evil God.
Which reminds me of Stephen Law's evil God hypothesis, which is a way of dealing with theodicies. So the idea that a theist says, as you mentioned, theodicy is a ways of defending why evil exists or suffering exists. And again, we haven't quite defined that, but the theist will say, well, it exists because you need this sort of perfect amount of evil in order for good to make sense, or whatever way they use their theodicies. But Stephen Law just takes that idea and says, well, actually, you can just flip that 180 and say, what if there's a perfectly evil God that exists, and this is just the right amount of good to arrive at the optimal amount of evil? And of course, the theist can't really very easily I mean, you can look at that argument by bringing outside arguments to do with like the Bible or whatever, and your understanding of God, but in and of itself, that is a very difficult concept for theists to completely reject.
Well, because it all comes down to what we want. We want a world with less suffering in it. So we build our God to give us what we want.
I'll borrow from Stranger Things, the TV show. And if we live in an upside down world and there is an omnipotent evil God, we will be still talking about the problem of goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is right. That is good.
But so it's interesting when you think about, say, aliens, and you think, right, so an alien comes down and says, well, am I allowed to schnecker around here? And you go, well, what's schneckering? Like, so how can I tell whether schneckering is good or bad? So and I often think about this. So I think, well, the way I would work out whether it's good or bad is, does it give harm to other people? You know, does it harm other moral entities or other creatures or whatever? And you can argue about how far you want to take your moral behavior. But so therefore, and I'm sure Dan will have a lot to say about this, but it seems to me that evil is about harm, causing harm, and particularly unnecessarily.
Yeah, and it's not just harm itself, it's the overall picture, because you might have to cause some temporary harm. You might have to amputate an arm in order to save a life. Cutting off someone's arm is a horrible, harmful thing to do, but you might have to actually deliberately cause some harm so that in the overall picture, you are minimizing the total amount of evil or suffering.
And this is now the evolution and the development of theodicies. You know, we're starting from Aquinas, where they started to explain these things away, just exactly like Dan said. You know, the suffering is relative. What could be harmful to you is a character building exercise. God is trying to make sure that your persona grows over time, and therefore a little bit of suffering, what doesn't hurt you, what doesn't kill you, makes you stronger, type of analogy. And therefore, you know, God could be well justified for humanity to endure a bit of suffering in order to achieve bigger and larger things. What about that?
I think this becomes a problem when you talk about, I mean, because this is utilitarianism, which is to say that you are using people instrumentally for some greater good, some end. Now that's just about acceptable, I guess, if it's one person being used as a means for their own end. So, for example, if God gave me, I don't know, cancer or something, and you say, well, it's character building for me, or it improves me in some way, and then maybe in an afterlife it will get sorted out or whatever, you can just about justify, arguably, that kind of instrumentality, or instrumentalism. But if you're going to say that 6-month-old baby died, you know, and it builds a character of her family, you're like, well, that baby is being used instrumentally for the benefit of other people. That's when it becomes a little bit more problematic. So yeah, there needs to be careful conversations around there, and you know, just being used as a means to an end is not generally seen in Christian ethics as a good way of doing your morality.
You try to say God is consequentialist, just
well,
like
again, it comes back to this idea of yeah, this is, you know, looks like pure utilitarianism.
It's kind of like these people, when something horrible happens in their life, they say, well, I got through it because of God, and I became stronger, and I grew. My child ran out in the street and got run over by a truck, and it was horrible. We suffered, but in the end, we all learned this great lesson from it, and that our faith is stronger, and our character has been built, and we've endured the suffering. You hear these stories a lot from people, right? After a horrible thing happens. But if that's true, then you shouldn't stop your kid from running out into the street, right? Every parent in the world is going to want to stop their child naturally from that harm. But think of the character building you're denying yourself by keeping your kid from running out in the street. I mean, it's an absurd argument when you think about it.
I think it's a thing we tell ourselves to keep ourselves from going insane. I think it's like a self-consoling tools that we all practice. We all do it in one way or another, just to keep sane and to keep sort of your head cool. Like
So
to
this is what Stephen Mason, the philosopher, discussed in his paper "Ordinary Morality Implies Atheism," and his paper was exactly formalizing what Dan's just said. And he talks about as kind of moral paralysis that if so, I always use the example: if you're walking down the road and you see some granny on the other side of the road getting beaten up by some little kid, mugged, maimed, whatever, some terrible incident. Now, you know, if I wasn't walking down the street and that just happened, right, there is no such thing as gratuitous suffering in terms of omni-God and the theism around that. So if that happened, a greater good would have to come about, because if it didn't, there would be gratuitous suffering. Okay, so a greater good's going to have to come about that. Now I'm walking down the street and I see that. Do I go over and stop it? Well, if I stop it, as Dan says, then that is stopping a greater good coming. But there can be. So even if I choose to walk on, a greater good must come about from that. Otherwise, God is allowing gratuitous evil. So the argument is that basically you shouldn't stop any moral bad, because you are prohibiting the greater good from taking place. And this leads to moral paralysis. And Stephen Mason says that's obviously ridiculous. Like, ordinary morality that we have just implies that we're not going to do that. We are going to step in and stop that from happening. And so therefore, he says, ordinary morality implies atheism rather than theism.
I remember Christopher Hitchens talking about Mrs. Fritz. This is the Austrian lady who was kept captive by her dad in a cellar for over 25 years.
28 years, I think, yeah.
And he used to rape her, torture her. Even there were kids between the two, and he raped as well. And it was horrible. And Christopher Hitchens was very upset and said, "Are you telling me God wanted to have an end result, and that end result was pretty good, that woman's tears are going to be wiped away in some realm later on? But if God is omnipotent, why did it have to be designed that way? Why did she have to go through that in order for the greater thing to be achieved? Why couldn't God go to that greater thing immediately without having to have that suffering as a bridge to that particular greater good?"
In my debate with Rubel Shelley at Vanderbilt, he raised character building. And so I countered with animal suffering. There's a lightning strike and the forest catches fire, and there's a raging wildfire, and this family of deer is trying to escape, and they run. But the little fawn gets its legs stuck in a branch and it can't go on. And the parents are on the other side of the creek watching this little deer suffer a horrible, agonizing, lonely, inexplicable death, right? And this happens all the time in nature. So whose character was built as a result of that? I mean, what possible good came from that? Were these deer supposed to think, well, now I'm going to get closer to my big deer god in the sky because of this thing happened? In fact, empirically, we can see that suffering does not always lead to character building. More often, suffering leads to horrible worsening of a person's life. Their character gets destroyed. There's no good outcome that comes from it. So it seems to me that the character building theodicy is kind of special pleading, or kind of a desperate straw that they're looking for to try to prop up the goodness of their God.
It's a very good point, Dan, and I would like Jonathan I'd like to hear your opinion on that, because we always include humanity only, but sentient beings, creatures with a central nervous system who can feel pain, extend to the animal kingdom. In Australia, just 3 years ago, I'm sure you recall, 500 million animals perished in wood fires. And apparently the sound, people who lived in the vicinity, and they can hear the sound of screaming animals for weeks. Whose
So
design is this?
yeah, so what Dan was talking about was William Rowe's Fawn in the Forest Fire, and he constructs the evidential problem of evil, which is more of a probabilistic argument. And his formulation goes something like this: so one, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Two, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Three, therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. So that's how he formulates that kind of version. And what's really interesting there is if in Dan's scenario of the fawn, you have to say, or actually Fritz's one is probably even more evocative in this particular example here, with all those people involved and all that terrible suffering, like that there could be no other way that God could achieve the greater good he was looking for. So the theist has to argue that still provides a greater good, like whatever it is. Let's call it X. But this greater good X is achieved by all that terrible stuff with Fritz, all the forest fire. Now there could be no way that God could achieve X in a way that doesn't involve as much suffering as that, because otherwise, if there was a way, he would do that.
If he was good.
Yeah. So I think the problem of evil kind of emits an omnibenevolent God, but it does not create. I mean, but then you're going to have to sort of define what is a God. If there is a super entity that is so powerful, and it does not have to be totally or maximally powerful. It just needs to have evolved a few millennia before us, and might have had that complex intelligence and. Sort of gave rise to the world we live in. They're not good. Maybe they are just indifferent. They don't care.
Some of your viewers might be aware of the position called ignosticism, which is not atheism or agnosticism, it's ignosticism, which is the philosophical position that the question of the existence of God is meaningless because the term God has no coherent or unambiguous definition. So it's a really difficult position, like idea to define very, very precisely, and so therefore, having discussions about it is particularly difficult.
Yeah, definition of God is quite elusive, but at least, I mean, there were people would say, well, let's say God is actually kind of evil. I'm a pragmatic person. I don't want to spend eternity in hell. I am going to pretend that I am bowing to this. I mean, we see this in reality. We see people in front of very, very strong leaders will just bend the knee just to avoid suffering, and they will be quite justified in whatever they do because they don't want to be killed, they don't want to be tortured. But when we're talking about a God that is worthy of worshipping, and I think Satan probably would have been one of the very first creatures to say no. The Islamic version of this is God asked Satan to bow to humanity, and Satan said, well, I shouldn't be bound in front of everyone but you, one, and two, who are these creatures that you created from an inferior substance that I need to bow to? I'm not going to bow to anyone. So we have history that tells us this God has been, even though they've been witnessed firsthand, somebody told him, no, I am not going to respect your demands.
Yeah, I'm working on a book about worship right now. The title is The End of Worship. And we don't have time to talk about it in much depth, but there's no agreement about even what the word worship means, even historically or biblically or theologically. And so I do what William James did in his lectures on religion. I pick a definition and I say, for the purpose of this, we're going to go. But you're right. Most people who claim to worship God claim to adore the qualities of this God, whatever those qualities are. It could be benevolence, it could be power, it could be whatever, but people are bowing down. And most of the words translated worship biblically, and even in the Quran, have to do with obedience and kneeling and bowing and even postures of slavery, postures of bowing down. If you look at the postures of prayer, they're identical to the postures of slavery. Your head is down. You're making yourself small before the great master. Your wrists are shackled together, so you're no threat to them. And all of that basically is showing that I am little and you are big. So worship is this dynamic. And I'm arguing, and this is a little off the topic, but I'm arguing that worship in that very narrow sense of it, because religion existed for millennia before that, sacrifice and religion and belief in gods. But worship in the sense of bowing down before a big king, there could not have been a concept of bowing down before the King of Kings before there were kings. I think worship is a modern, in the sense of 6,000 years old modern, because cities are only 6,000 years old. So broad-reaching regional or universal authority did not enter the human consciousness until about the time of cities and empires and all of that, where you would in real life have to bow down before this master who needed slaves to construct their kingdoms, who needed all of that. So slave owners, kings, military leaders, plantation owners, and to some extent husbands have been involved in this sort of patchwork domestication of our species by weeding out the rebels and making sure that we all remain sheep that are obedient to the. Of course, what does the shepherd ultimately want to do with the sheep? The shepherd doesn't really love the sheep. The shepherd wants to fleece it or kill it, right? Eventually. So I guess I have to ask myself, can I actually bow down and worship honestly, not outwardly to save my skin, but can I honestly inside of myself say that I am adoring and worshiping and glorifying this Lord who would act in the ways that he acts?
I find this really interesting, Dan, because I've argued, and I argue in this book, about how God can't have anything that approaches free will. So let's say that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. So all of his actions have to be in the context of those three skills or traits. And then you say that he's got full omniscience of the divine foreknowledge of the future events, which includes his own actions. So if he has full divine foreknowledge of what he's going to do in the future, he can't deviate from that, because otherwise it would mean his foreknowledge is infallible. So he's just basically doing and being whatever he is, right? And there's no kind of choices. This literally, I would say he's like on these railroad tracks and cannot deviate. And so therefore, when you are seeing that from a human point of view down on earth, and you're saying, well, here's a thing that I'm expected to give praise for, but this thing is just doing what this thing is. In other words, for me, worship is odd in that context, because it makes as much sense as praising a rock, right, or giving worship to a rock, which is just sitting there doing what it does, and it just is this thing that, for whatever. Do you get my point?
The rock of ages.
Well, there is a rock somewhere in the middle of Saudi Arabia that people sort of rotate around, so it's not very a strange analogy. You're onto something, Dan. The word in Arabic for slavery means abd, and the word for worshipping is also yabud, which is from the same root. The name Abdullah, which Abdullah means literally the slave of Allah.
Yeah, and in the Hebrew too, abad is the same word. In the Ten Commandments, you shall not worship other idols. Don't abad, don't bow down to them like a slave. But a few verses later, 6 days you shall labor, and on the seventh day you should rest. That word labor is also the same word, abad. Different word, same word means different things in different concepts.
Yes.
So worship is a kind of a service, a bowing, a showing, a ritual, and a kneeling down as a slave before this Lord. I wanted to add to what you just said, John, another analogy about worshiping a rock. It could be like the battered woman who has no options, who tells her abusive husband how much she loves him. What else can she do?
I've really been wanting, and I was speaking to Hanny about this actually in a previous interview. I do want to write a piece. I know it's been done before. This is not like particularly new, but like the abusive relationship paradigm between God and worshippers is very much like the abusive relationship that you see in between humans, and I think it's really quite an eye-opening analogy or parallel there. Can I say something about instrumentality again, like the idea of God using people for particular ends. The other problem I have with this is, so if the theist says, well, God gave you or allowed you to get cancer, gave you cancer. I mean, he designed the universe in such a way that cancer came to be, and designed the universe knowingly that you would get it. So that's, pretty much God gave you cancer. If God gave you cancer and the theist is saying, well, okay, that's for a greater good, there's a complete lack of consent here. And I think this is really important. So that would be fine. Like if God came to me and said, by the way, is it all right if I give you cancer? It's going to give you a greater good. There's going to be a greater good that comes out about it. Or is it okay if I kill that 6-month-old baby to the parents or to the baby itself and somehow communicate, because it's going to be a greater good for the whole family or something like this? It's this idea that God will happily use people instrumentally, but with a complete lack of consent. And this is a real problem. I forget why I was reading an essay on that recently, but yeah, anyway.
Do you think then, as on the back of the situation where a lot of people would actually obey and worship God because really they don't want to be tortured, where Tolkien might have been of a coping mechanism, almost like a collective Stockholm syndrome, if you wish, to be able to cope with the feeling, okay, well, there is no escaping this God. There is nowhere I can go. There's nowhere to hide. Might as well convince myself that he's brilliant. He's good. He wants best for me. Otherwise, I'm just going to go insane. So this is just the way I'm going to cope.
100%.
Well, that's what people have done historically with the monarchy. They know that their kings and queens have been corrupt, but they've got to go. If they want to survive in this world, or if they want to advance, they've got to kiss the feet of the Lord.
But I think also... But the function
have we become then, because if we created that God, obviously we don't know. A lot of people don't know that this concept is created. But funnily, from the outside here, have we become captive to an idea that we have created in the first place?
Yeah. I think God provides a function for explaining how the world is ultimately just. I really do. Like heaven and hell, for me, without the concepts of heaven and hell, Christianity wouldn't really exist. I think most major religions that get great purchase, like Islam and Christianity, do so because they provide this idea of an eternal life and an afterlife. And it's the afterlife that allows you to believe in that God is still all loving, because all the crap that goes on earth is balanced in heaven. And I think so. I think, when you're talking about the problem of evil, heaven and hell are super important to that, the idea. But also, just to go back to, and we're going to get onto natural evil, I'm sure, but you mentioned about like the fawns dying in the forest fire, Dan, and any other example of animal pain and suffering. Now, if these animals are sentient creatures and they feel that pain and suffering, then actually the only way that a theist, I don't think theists go far enough with their kind of thinking about this. The only way to justify that is that those individual animals get some eternal existence after life, or some kind of existence after life, where that evil for them personally is justified. Right? Because if that evil is justified to other entities, then that is using that entity instrumentally and is horrible. And it's that entity never gets to feel or experience the greater good that its death and suffering or whatever provides. So therefore, and I was speaking with Joe Schmidt recently about this, which is like, yeah, the only real way to get around some of these problem of evil issues is that every sentient entity that feels suffering gets some kind of afterlife. So if you're a theist that really believes in an afterlife, you have to stretch that to animals as well.
Yeah, it's been blatantly mentioned, and I'll get Dan's opinion on the Old Testament and the Bible and the Quran. It's made very clear that dominion over all animals. They're here to serve. So we are just like here to serve God. Animals are here to serve us. We can do whatever we please. We ride them, we eat them, we grill them, we barbecue them. So therefore, if they are used as an instrument for human prosperity and for us to learn lessons from, considering that we've only been on this planet for Homo sapiens 300,000 years, and we're talking about mammals, where
but that doesn't explain a burning fawn, though. That doesn't explain a burning fawn. That doesn't serve us.
Oh, true. I'm with you. I'm saying that these animals pre-existed humanity for millions of years before human consciousness was even around. There is nothing. There are no lessons to draw. So how can that suffering be explained? And it is absolutely nothing to learn from.
So just a small counter, perhaps it's an exception that proves the rule to the idea about heaven and hell. Judaism is a pretty robust religion without any concept of heaven and hell. Although, at least in my country, most Jews that I know are actually atheists. We have a joke here in the United States. What do you call a Jew who doesn't believe in God? A Jew. But still, as a religion, having ancient roots, common roots to the Abrahamic religions, I don't think most Jews put much concept in eternal judgment into their worship of their God.
Absolutely, Dan. But what I was saying there was most major religions, and I mentioned Christianity and Islam. I didn't mention Judaism, and the reason I didn't mention Judaism is because most people don't actually realize how small the number of people in the world who are Jews.
Yeah.
And I would argue, in fact, that leads into my argument that if you want a big religion, if you want a religion to take hold and spread, you need concepts of afterlife. They are functionally necessary for a religion to have that emotive purchase on human psyches.
But to their credit, Jews as a minority, they're less than 2% in my country, have an oversized presence in the law and in the arts and in culture. I mean, Jews have been a powerful force in many countries.
Yeah, they're always around in small numbers, but obviously you can't really enter Judaism. You can, but really you can't. You might not be accepted. You've got to have a Jewish mother at least. Yeah. It's one of those religions that sort of does not go out of its way to convert people into their own religion. Yeah, but you're right. The concept of a payment. So we have here human consciousness have developed to understand the difference between favorable situation, misery, goodness, happiness, and we started to we can compare our condition to somebody else's, and for those who will not be able to achieve this in their lifetime ever, they know they're never going to be healthy, they're never going to be rich. They live in conditions where if they have a meal that day, that's a brilliant outcome. They have no ambition in life. Would it be then kind of cruel to take away the one thing that keeps them anchored? Like Ricky Gervais in his work, if you look at what he always sort of installed this little bit of humanity, where there is a situation where somebody like a dying mother, or a person with an illness that they believe in heaven where things are going to be better later on. And he, even though he's an atheist, always been portrayed as an atheist in his work, that he will stop and will work with that person, say, yeah, things will be fine. It will be brilliant. We're going to play volleyball in heaven with a person with a disability, I think in extras. What would each of you do when you're faced with that situation?
Well, I mean, I completely understand that, and this is just to talk about the functional, or the function of God. So God psychologically has a function. I mean, we've kind of evolved God to fit our needs, right? And our needs are to give us comfort in sort of something called terror management theory. So the idea of dealing with death and mortality salience, and that kind of existential terror that some people might feel, God provides an answer for that. Not being able to explain certain things, like how does X or Y work, God does that job. And so we have lots of things that over time God has been able to provide the answer for or help us with. But we're at a point in time now where I don't think we need that anymore. But for some people, that comfort blanket is still super important. And you're right, if someone is living in desperate conditions for an entire life, and they are only just hanging on due to their belief in some kind of wonderful paradisic afterlife, then to take that away from them might be a little bit harsh. So yeah, there you go. It's just like, well, does your terrible life, is that really better explained by an all-loving God or by naturalistic atheism? And I think, and I really want to talk about abductive reasoning
I
in a
want to
second.
hear Dan's opinion,
Yeah,
considering that the very idea, that consolation idea to console a broken soul, a broken heart, is the very idea that's been used to also commit a lot of horrible acts, like getting people to believe this in the first place so they can submit.
So what John just said can go a long way toward explaining why countries and societies that are worse off, that are suffering, have a higher prevalence of religion than countries who are better off, like the Nordic countries. Their needs are met. They are generally happier, more functional. In Finland or Denmark, especially, where only I think 4% believe in God, they don't feel the need then to reach up to win that cosmic lottery. Religion goes down. So there might be some kind of a, I don't know, evidentiary argument here about how religions evolve. But you asked earlier, Hanny, why would we want to take this away from people who have this hope? Why would we want to do that? Well, we're not doing that. We're not even trying to do that. The Freedom from Religion Foundation is not barging into churches on Sunday morning and dragging people out of their pews. How can you be so stupid? A person's going to choose to believe what they want. And there's no way that the three of us, with our supposedly great philosophical meanderings here, we're going to convince that person on the hospital bed. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? And I don't think any of us want it to happen. Like Ricky Gervais saying, well, they're living in their world of comfort. And you know, when my grandparents died, there was no way I was going to be this big smart aleck atheist and come, yeah, you're believing in death. That's not going to happen. I just let them be who they are, and as long as and this relates to your second part of your question, Hanny, as long as their beliefs do not lead to actions that are causing more harm than necessary.
Mhm.
And in that case, I think we do have a moral obligation to speak up. If, for example, a Christian family refuses medical treatment to their children because the Bible says the prayer of faith will heal the sick, right? That's causing harm. In fact, people have died. There was a young girl up here a few years ago in northern Wisconsin. On Easter morning, she died a horrible death from easily treatable diabetes because the parents refused to disobey God and take her to the hospital. Instead, they brought in the preacher to put oil on her forehead and pray for her, and then she died. So in my mind, that is evil. If you're talking about the problem of evil, those teachings that ignore science and reality and ignore facts and that lead to the immediate suffering of other human beings out of obedience to God or worship of God, that is a real evil in the world. And that's something that I think we moral people have an obligation to protest, not the beliefs, but the actions that lead to harm.
Something that is going to result into the point of natural evil is the next theodicy, or one of the most important elements have been brought up to defend the justice of God, which is free will. Very abused concept. It's like, well, God created free will. Otherwise, we would have been like angels, sort of determined to worship and obey. He wanted that experiment where a conscious being rejects or accepts God with a complete free will. So the installation of free will in humanity, obviously with the original sin, added that portion of suffering and evil in humanity. And I'd like to hear Jonathan's idea on that.
Well, as you, my opinions on free will. In fact, Dan Barker's written an excellent book on free will, although we marginally disagree. I mean, the broad brushstrokes are that libertarian free will, as commonly understood, doesn't exist. Now, if you have a theodicy that says, well, this evil came about because it's a natural collateral of the use of free will, then that only goes so far, right? So, yeah, you can make good decisions, but unfortunately with free will, you can make bad decisions. Yeah, but again, when 240,000 people die in a tsunami in 2004, well, what does that have to do with free will? And also natural evil. So as in animal suffering, what does that have to do with free will? And so even if you granted libertarian free will as a coherent concept, which I completely and utterly don't, but I don't want to derail the whole conversation with that, it still only answers a certain amount of instances of suffering, and this is why theists generally will use an accumulation of different theodicies to try and get out of a sticky situation. But I think this is why, as well, that the natural evil arguments, problem of evil arguments, are so much more powerful, because you're taking away all the kind of human, all this kind of idea of it's all humans' fault, and you're saying, right, okay, these animals were created and they've died and they've suffered horribly. Explain that.
So I think the concept of free will, the illusion of free will, even though there is no such thing as free will in any sense, in society, I think the concept of free will, in other words, assuming that people are acting freely, whether they are or not, can be useful in the justice system. It can be useful for us as a society, giving a justification for why we would lock up a criminal. A criminal could say, hey, criminal could argue all the way back to the Big Bang, hey, I'm just a result of a bunch of atoms bouncing around. Why are you putting me on trial here? So in a vertical, not the horizontal cause and effect world, but in the vertical world of the social world we live in, there can be some usefulness to, let's call it the lie or the illusion of free will. There can be some usefulness so that we can have some moral justification for locking up criminals or for passing judgment on people like that. But back to what John was saying, natural evil, of course, the tsunami. In the mid 18th century, this whole debate, right in the middle of the Enlightenment and all of that, Voltaire and Locke and all of these, Goethe and others, there was a horrible tragedy that happened on November the 1st, 1755. November the 1st was All Saints' Day. And in Lisbon, Portugal, all of these people had come out on that Saturday morning. They were all packed in these churches to pray to God on All Saints' Day. People from outside had come into town, and there was beautiful stone cathedrals. And it was about 9 o'clock in the morning. They were all in there praying. A huge earthquake hit the city, massive earthquake, 10 times stronger than the one that destroyed San Francisco. I mean, just bang. And these stone churches fell, and thousands of people, as they were worshiping to God, they were immediately crushed and killed. And then survivors were screaming, and some people tried to escape who were outside. They tried to run to the ocean. Well, then about 15 minutes later, the tsunamis hit. And tsunami after tsunami killed a lot more people, a horrible destruction. And that wasn't the worst, because then the fires started raging for days through that city. And any survivors who might have been trapped under a rock or something, they were incinerated. And then, even worse than that, the hospitals were destroyed, but so were the prisons. So a bunch of prisoners escaped, and they went around raping and killing and stealing any of the lucky survivors. It was horrible. It was one of the most horrible tragedies imaginable.
What city was this
that
again?
was the basis of the famous poem that Voltaire then wrote this poem. And when the rest of Europe heard about this tragedy, why were these people that were praying to God, they were killed by this horrible natural thing? They didn't understand earthquakes back then, or tectonic plates. They had some weird ideas about what might have caused them. But of course, as you can predict, the church came up with all of these religious reasons. God was punishing these people because Lisbon was a horrible, sinful city. And all over the world, you hear arguments like that. And even up in England, when they heard about the tragedy, they immediately outlawed masquerade balls, presumably because that would lead to great sinning, and they wanted people to be more chaste.
Obviously.
And there was a big debate in Europe amongst the intellectual people about why did this happen, and would it happen, and could it? And some people tried to blame humans, free will, because, well, they should have known better to build a city where earthquakes happen. I mean, it was all this stupid stuff going on. There's a great book about it, by the way, that I read called This Gulf of Fire, written by Mark Molesky, that goes into great detail, not only about the tragedy, but about how the church, about how the Pope in Italy, about how the bishops, in fact, every Saturday after that, they would have a prayer against earthquakes, to stop earthquakes from happening. So this issue goes way back, but really that kind of sparked it, because the age of faith was sort of starting to wane, and the age of reason was starting to come up. And so when that tragedy happened, it caused a big discussion about the nature of this God. And of course, I call my article supernatural evil. I don't think it was moral evil from free will, or even natural evil. How can you call a natural thing evil? But if God is behind it all, then what happened was an act of God. And if you notice, like in insurance contracts, when something horrible happens, what do we call that? An act of God, right? The insurance company is off the hook because you never hear of an act of God being something good.
But I want to add a point of discussion, because why are we trying to sort of imagine what's God thinking, while there are books written about him or by him or inspired by him, where I believe the Bart Ehrman, The Problem of Evil is one of the reasons why he left Christianity in the first place, and he can actually show, according to the Old Testament and the New Testament, that God would use evil or suffering in different ways to inflict direct harm. Like, for example, the killing of the firstborn in Egypt for Moses to be let go and his people. Wasn't that a direct action by God to kill a bunch of innocent people to achieve something that it could have easily achieved in some different ways?
100%. Yeah, completely. I think that's one of the most horrific stories in the Bible, actually, the 10 plagues of Egypt, and it's kind of bypassed most people's moral sensibilities because they're born and brought up with it, and they kind of don't question it from an objective point of view. But when you look at God, so it's an interesting comment on free will as well. So Pharaoh, either God doesn't quite know whether Pharaoh is going to say yes or no, so hedges his bets and hardens his heart, or God knows he's going to say yes and hardens his heart. So either way, God is in trouble here as a concept. So Pharaoh says no, but he has his heart hardened, and then God kills the firstborn of every firstborn in the nation of Egypt. Like, it's very explicit there. Is everyone. So
I believe including animals.
Yeah, and then you've got all the animal firstborn as well, and also all the other animal issues that
Very
go along with that.
strange.
And it's just, if you believe that is historically true, like God is just genocidal, and the argument is that must have been the only way. The theist has to submit that this is the only way he could achieve that greater good. And
sorry, Jonathan, I'm just trying to, because I think Ray is trying to make these comments, and I'm trying to explain something. When atheists entertain ideas that we know that they're myth, that they haven't happened, we're not talking to them about them as if they're facts or the stories that have actually happened. We are examining the concept in which believers believe, so we can actually critique it, and therefore might get people who believe in these stories to rethink them. But we don't entertain them from the point of view that these have happened and therefore God is evil. We don't believe God exists in the first place.
And actually, I'm writing a book on the Exodus at the moment, and I think there's one survey, and it is 2006, I think now 2008, but something like, well, still the large majority of Americans still believe it to be literally true. So
yeah.
So in the story of the plagues, we don't have to wonder what God was doing. He was very explicit, and of course, we don't think the story happened. I mean, I don't think the story happened, and I think even most Israeli and most scholars agree that Exodus never happened. But it's a story, and taking the story at face value, we can ask if this character is good or bad. Just like we could ask, is the big bad wolf a good person or a bad person? We're not admitting that they exist, but we're judging the morality of a character regardless. But in the plagues, in the first 7 plagues, Pharaoh said, no, you can't go. After the 7th plague, Pharaoh then said, okay, they can go. Then God hardened his heart. He said, wait a minute, I'm not done yet. And so then after the 8th plague, Pharaoh said, okay, I get it, they can go. And then again, God said, no, they can't. God's the one who said no. And finally, it was the final one of the firstborn children, right? And God was very explicit about this. Maybe the number 10 was important to him. I don't know, because we have 10 fingers on our hands. But God said very clearly in that story, that fictional story, that the reason I'm doing this is to show you my power. He had a bag of tricks that he wanted to bring out. I'm going to do the locust. I'm going to do the darkness thing. I'm going to turn the river into blood. Imagine if that happened. I mean, how much blood would it take to fill the Nile River? But anyway, so finally, and it was finally the last one, which of course hit Pharaoh personally because his own firstborn, you know. So finally, Pharaoh relented and said he can go. It wasn't because of Pharaoh's free will. Pharaoh, if you believe in free will, Pharaoh exercised it and changed his mind at plague number 7. After that, who was in control? So really the villain in the story is God himself. He just wanted to be a big bully. Say uncle, show I'm powerful, I'm strong, you need to bow down, I'll show you how big I am. Okay, I'm satisfied now, you can go. That's the whole so-called moral tale behind the Exodus.
And the significance of this story is here is evil. We're putting our finger on an act of evil directly committed by God, not as an act of free will, not as an act of character building. It's a direct killing of innocent people who have absolutely no stake in the story. These are children. You know, some of them might have been 2 weeks old, for all I know. It just, you know.
And it's almost, I mean, you're absolutely right, Hanny. It's absolutely just completely morally nonsensical. It's just like that would be, if that happened, that's enough for me to go, no, I reject this. But going to what Dan was saying, and I know it's slightly off topic, but to say that, I mean, this is all about God showing his power. He's quite explicit about this. I think I forget what the exact words are, but he's basically saying this is so I can show you my power type thing. But the interesting part of the story is that the Egyptians then, after being shown this supreme power of God, promptly go back to believing in what they believed in anyway, right? They don't become Jews, they don't become Hebrews, or they don't change their belief systems at all. In fact, like, Judaism doesn't take purchase in Israel till a diaspora community something like 1,000 years later, right? So this is for the Hebrews alone. The Hebrews then go off and then start doubting anyway, or start having issues anyway, and it's like, what, you've just done all this. If any Egyptian would have seen that, would have actually historically literally seen that happen, seen all this stuff, everyone knew it was God that did that. You're telling me that people go, well, I don't believe in that God, I'm still going to believe in Seth and you know, Ra and whatever. It's like, oh, yeah, come on.
Or they would have been more afraid of their own Pharaoh than of some external religion.
Yeah, I mean, one verification in the after the occupation of Israel of Egypt in 1967, they entered the Sinai area. This is where the Jews were supposed to have been lost for about 40 years. We're talking about 1.2 million, according to some numbers, of people. We're talking about 2 to 3 generations because of the life expectancy then, living in an area just to find a needle. In that area, there was nothing. There's absolutely, the Egyptians are very, they used to document a lot of things. Imagine going through that and not document the thing. Let's say, well, they're too embarrassed because they were defeated so badly. What about the neighboring civilizations who carry animosity and they say, well, they want to show Egyptians not to be as strong as they are? We have a supernova happened about 1,000 years ago, recorded by the Chinese. Yet the splitting of the moon by the Muslims, by the Prophet Muhammad, is done at night while people were asleep, apparently.
Yeah, so I mean, Kadesh Barnea being around there for 40 years. I mean, 40 is just a symbolic number. I don't think, you know, the whole thing, the whole story just falls apart every single way you look at it. And you can spend hours. I mean, as I say, I'm halfway through a book on that topic.
Well, besides that, John, I'm sure you've touched on this. It wasn't just the million Hebrews that were out there wandering in this little area. They reported thousands of cattle. And how much pasture and grazing land was required for thousands of these cattle? The cattle were there basically to be sacrifices because Pharaoh said, you can go in one case. And Moses said, well, we need to take our cattle with us too. Oh, why? You didn't say that. So they're wandering with this huge herds. There ought to have been some archaeological evidence of, I mean, how much grazing land would it take to maintain cattle of that size?
And that is not grazing land either. So yeah. But they're provided with manna, so it's all right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and kilos of gold who they've somehow melted. I mean, it's crazy stuff. Like, it's like insane.
By the way, there's a cute little side story that I hadn't really paid much attention to when I was a preacher. when the Israelites got into the wilderness, and they celebrate the Passover because the angel of death passed over their doors because of the blood. There was this huge bargaining thing that happened out in the wilderness, where the Israelites realized their firstborn sons were saved. And so in the history of the Jewish religion, there was this thing called the blessing of the firstborn. So, it didn't have to be the firstborn. Jacob and Esau, they swapped it. And Joseph was not the firstborn son. Joseph was the firstborn of the wife that he loved, that his father loved. So out in the wilderness, there was a big swap of all of these firstborn children, the blessing that these firstborn children supposedly carried with them by virtue of being the firstborn. They counted it up and swapped it and moved it over to the tribe of Levi. And the tribe of Levi then were, for a certain amount of cattle, they did this bargaining for a certain amount of cattle of swapping. The whole tribe of Levi then inherited that firstborn blessing. And from that date on, the Levites were the priests. From that time on, Levites then had that blessing. And by extension, anybody who's an ordained clergy has this so-called blessing of the firstborn. So it's kind of a interesting, it's not historical, but an interesting theological wrinkle to explain why one class of people, the Levites, were suddenly above or blessed above the rest of the community.
So we talked about a direct evil or suffering committed directly by God or his angel of death, which is, God. And you think at this point, okay, well, maybe this is all analogy and God is going to teach humanity some really good lesson. He was very upset by the enslavement of his people. You think his people should be all humanity, but let's say, well, maybe he would use them as an example or analogy to come in the Ten Commandments and say, hey, I've created you all free, so do not enslave each other. He doesn't do that. And that he would order his chosen people later on to do the very same thing that he saved them from. And in a divine command theory type of, you commit evil in my name and you've got my permission and license to do so. What's that all about?
It's a double standard. This applies to them, but not to us.
It's incredible. How can people be impartial and believe in fairness and be able to combine these two ideas?
Oh, it's just the strength of motivated reasoning is huge, and I will defer back to ideas of heaven and hell. Like heaven and hell are the biggest carrot and stick. If I got the right way around, yes, the biggest carrot and stick in human conceptions. There's nothing greater that you can imagine greater than heaven, because otherwise that would be heaven. There's nothing worse that you can imagine than hell, because otherwise that would be hell. So therefore, these are the biggest bribes in human thoughts, therefore, I mean, everyone would love to live forever in paradise. I mean, just like that's a given. And so therefore, if that's your thing, and that's what you're being promised by this religion or by this worldview, then any issue you come across is competing with the idea of heaven. So any issue about God or about morality or about the Exodus account or about this or about that has to be powerful enough to overcome your desire, your motivation to see yourself living in heaven.
Actually, Jonathan, you put your something that you said just now. Quite interested in the order of the words. I think you said carrot and stick, and I think it might be the stick and the carrot, because
I said heaven and hell, carrot and stick. But yeah,
but I'm thinking here, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're more motivated as human species by avoiding suffering rather than seeking pleasure.
There is risk avoidance as well. Yeah. So I mean, both of those are valid there. So therefore, it's about getting to heaven or avoiding hell.
Yeah.
And avoiding hell.
And avoiding, in the Quran, the hell verses are absolutely in abundance there. It's very high motivational thing to avoid suffering. And then as a bonus, you might get to have a bit of pleasure later on. But the very first motivation is to avoid that horrible, horrible eternal torment. What about you, Dan? What do you reckon?
I think you're right. I think, You know, Armin Navabi, he talks about how hell was his big thing. In fact, he actually went and burned himself with a cigarette so he could experience. And he said, and wow, it's horrible. And I'm going to have to suffer that for eternity over and over. And I think in the Quran, I debated a number of Muslims in the past, public debates. And during one of the debates in Colorado, I mentioned this verse or passage in the Quran, and you can confirm, honey, because you're the world expert on the Quran. So that the skin's going to burn off of your flesh, but then Allah is going to grow it back again, so that it can burn it off again and again and again and again, forever and ever. So he's doing this, you know. And so when I mentioned that during this debate in Colorado, I said, this God's going to be up there looking down and doing that to me. I'm going to be suffering. And the imam who's sitting next to me on the platform, the imam went on camera. He went like that. He was cheering this act of terror and torture as a good thing in his mind. Is that your experience with Muslim leaders, that they would think like that?
Well, you know, Zakir Naik, the Indian doctor who goes around parading Islam, he's actually been sent to Qatar as we speak to preach Islam during the World Cup. So nice. They'll have the dance and then everything going on, and they have invited that Muslim scholar to convert people to Islam. But he would actually recite this verse as a wonderful insight that how did God know about science? Because science later on discovers that the areas that where we feel the pain is right under the skin, and this is a sign that the Allah knows it all, and how wonderful that he completely forgets about the moral aspects of this. Which is wrong, by the way, because we don't actually feel in the skin. The skin sends signals to the brain. It's actually the brain is the one that actually does the feeling for you. Because there are people with the issues where that connection is severed, and you can put a cigarette on their skin and they won't feel a thing.
So before I die, should I sever those nerves?
It would be a kind of a solution for a lot of painful issues.
Can I just make a comment on? I mean, I know Dan's mentioned a couple of debates he's been in already. I think Hani and myself are the two of the only 6 people in the world that Dan hasn't debated. So,
well, let's find something to debate then.
But I mean, no. In all seriousness, you've got such a phenomenal back catalogue. I mean, do you have the record for debates or something? I don't know.
Maybe, yeah.
I think so. In February, I'm doing debate, and I've been counting. I've been keeping track. Public, moderated, formal debates with a moderator. I'll be doing debate number 139 in Florida. That sounds like a lot. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's been 40 years, so that comes out to maybe 4 a year. You know, not
I think you and Aaron Ra, because Aaron Ra as well is like every conversation you have with him is more kind of a debate.
Well, but I'm talking about. I'm not counting TV shows or talk shows or radio interviews. I'm not talking. Yeah. I'm not counting those. I'm just talking about
the formal, yeah,
before an audience with a moderate, that kind of a debate, an actual formal debate.
So I reckon we were still talking a little bit about natural evil. There's a couple of points I'd like to make, if that's okay, Hani, on natural evil. A few of them. One is about carnivorousness, and I know I've spoken about this with you before, but this is one of the arguments mentioned in here, which is like, and again, and I wanted to mention abductive arguments. So abductive arguments is an inference to the best explanation. So this is where you have 2 competing hypotheses: naturalistic atheism and omni-god theism, right? So then you look at all the evil in the world. This is kind of how the evidential problem of evil argument works, which is you look at all the evil in the world and you say, well, which hypothesis does this probabilistically better support? And the more and more evil that we see and experience, does it support the fact that omni-god theism explains everything, or naturalistic atheism? And likewise, you can go the other way. So let's start with naturalistic atheism or omni-god theism. What world or what universe would you predict from that? Again, would this be the sort of universe you would predict? Would you predict black holes? Would you predict, the heat death of the universe? Would you predict cancer, Ebola, plate tectonics and all this stuff. And I wouldn't predict that on omni-god theism, and I don't think omni-god theism is the best explanation of that. You can explain it, but you have to jump through hoops, and you have to, and we'll talk about skeptical theism, I presume, in a bit, because it's a huge conversation. But carnivorousness, is that what you'd expect given omni-god theism? So animals having to eat other animals merely to survive, right, and requiring the suffering and death of other animals to get their energy. So then you start thinking, no, okay, so why can't God can do photosynthesis of plants, so why couldn't he design us to photosynthesis? That's well beyond his remit and ability. We should all be able to photosynthesize, and then we wouldn't need to eat each other. And then you're thinking, well, why do we need bodies at all? Why do we need to have energy? And then you start getting into arguments, well, why didn't God just create the people who are going to go to heaven in heaven and not create all the other people? Just create heaven. And so, all these arguments are kind of interconnected, but it starts with, like, for me, it starts with carnivorousness is clearly, like, it's a problem of evil argument, but it's a design argument as well, which definitely is better explained by.
But if you consider naturalism, it's completely explained away without a problem, because that's animals have exploited a source of energy that's freely available by devouring other animals. It's just
you would predict it. You could predict carnivorousness on naturalistic atheism, and it better explains it. So either way round you look at it, but for omni-god theism, it has a real problem.
So I would add to that, John, that even if that argument had some merit, even if they were right, an abductive argument doesn't prove anything. An abductive argument, it's just the step necessary to put something on the table. Abduction is what investigators use when they're trying to solve a crime. They come up with a suspect. All right, so even if they're good at, even if the theists do come up with an intelligent designer is their suspect, they still have to take it to court. They have to provide evidence. They have to convince a jury to produce a verdict. So an abductive argument has some worth as a kind of a preliminary step. But even if it's right, they still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, well, it looks like the suspect is going to be an absentia in here. This is crazy, but let's develop this problem of evil to probably the last bits of it.
Well, there is something else to be said about natural evil as well. So the other one is to do with evolution, and there's an argument against. It's called the Darwinian problem of evil. So do you mind if I just spell that out?
Yeah,
is that all right?
I'm interested.
So I'm quoting from my book, page 117. So animal suffering as a result is seen by many thinkers as the strongest challenge to the defense of the problem of evil. Here is an example of such an argument that could be formulated. 1, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good. 2, the evil of extensive animal suffering exists. 3, necessarily God can actualize an evolutionarily perfect world. I'll explain that in a minute. 4, necessarily God can actualize an evolutionarily perfect world only if God does actualize an evolutionarily perfect world. 5, necessarily God actualized an evolutionarily perfect world. So 5 follows from 3 and 4, but we have a contradiction since 5 and 2 cannot both be true. So it appears 1 is false. Anyway, let me explain that. The argument is to say that God could predict the mechanisms of evolution and design one in which animal suffering is minimized. This scenario can be called an evolutionarily perfect world. We could imagine a scenario where God could put in place an evolutionary system whereby, for example, just before a gazelle is given a killing bite by a lion, a gene is expressed and naturally tranquilizes the gazelle, or some such similar situation. But this appears not to be the case. Instead, we have extensive animal suffering that is hard baked into the evolutionary system and the world. So the evolution, which is predicted by naturalistic atheism, which is better explained by naturalistic atheism, evolution has hard baked into it these ideas of the reality of great suffering for loads of entities within the evolutionary world, and suffering is not minimized. But one would expect that if God existed, that kind of suffering would be minimized, or at least far less than it is. And again, this goes back to the carnivorous thing as well. But so this is a way that some atheistic arguers have approached the problem of evil argument, which is to introduce evolution and natural.
Jonathan, you're onto something here, because when you think about suffering is a human construct. This is our mind trying to explain away the central nervous system function. Because remember, pain. Without pain, we would have all died and perished without any alarm bells, because the pain in biological systems functions as an alarm that something is wrong. Do something about it, or you might die. So it has a very good reason to exist. But when it's pressed and it's pressed and it's pressed without any attendance, it turns into suffering, and then we can conceive of that word suffering. But when you think about it in scientific and biological terms, it's very, very, very useful.
I think that's one of the main reasons that John Loftus, in his most recent book, last book, he titled the book not The Problem of Evil, but he called it God and Horrendous Suffering, because the problem of evil is broader than just free will and morality. It also involves horrendous suffering in the world.
And the other thing to say about pain, though, is that pain is correlated. And again, what would you expect given these two hypotheses, right? Pain correlates with evolution, and we can understand why pain exists from evolutionary theorizing, right? That's not a problem. But pain does not correlate, and pleasure does not correlate with moral bad or moral good. So pain, interestingly, like if you were predicting an all-loving God creating and creating a universe, you would probably expect that pain would be some kind of indicator of moral badness, but actually it's not holy. And the same with pleasure, that's not holy, correlated with moral goodness. In fact, there's a kind of like there's a lot of confusion there.
Unless you're being interrogated and somebody's trying to squeeze information out of you, and they will use the pain as a method to grab that information from you, or as an entity punishing you for not loving them back, such as God.
But you have to build all these add-ons to explain this stuff. I mean, and this is where we probably get onto skeptical theism, which is like, there must be some reason, don't know what it is, but...
Well, yeah. I think you're right, John. If pain were the measure, then if the measure of moral choices or moral consequences, then there would be nothing morally wrong with me coming up to you as you are sound asleep in bed and shooting a gun through your head. You would feel nothing. You would feel no pain. You would not suffer. And I could argue, well, I did nothing immoral. I didn't cause any pain. Of course, morality is broader than just feeling pain.
Yeah. What if you're a masochist? What if you draw sexual pleasure or pleasure from having a little bit? There are people who have those tendencies. Would it be relative then? Would it be then not causing them pain would be the bad thing to do? It gets very complicated, but we can all agree inflicting or exciting that nervous system function in order just purely to see the other person suffering, and God does that in a way that nobody else does. Even the intrigator who's exerting the sort of pain on people, it's not gratuitous. There is a reason behind that torturing, which is I'm going to try to squeeze information. You're a spy. I'm squeezing information out of you. Once you've given me this, I probably end up killing you or letting you go, whatever. But I'm not going to continue to torture you for the rest of your existence. Only one entity does that.
Or two, if there's two gods. Allah and Yahweh might be competing.
What about a dualistic entity like the Zoroastrian, the Ahura Mazda and Ahura Man, a totally, like equal entities. One is good and one is evil, and they are fighting amongst themselves.
The yin and the yang.
Yeah. Is that coherent?
I mean, it's interesting. So when people talk about Satan in this kind of yin yang situation where God is in this eternal battle with good against evil, if God truly is omnipotent, then God has the power to just snuff out Satan like that. So any Christian or theist who believes in Satan must understand that Satan's continued existence is on the behest of God, and whatever Satan does, whatever temptation he gives to humanity, is allowed by God, because if God didn't want it, God could stop it like that. God doesn't stop it like that, so therefore it's what God wants. And that's why I always call God Satan God's middle manager, just like delivering what God wants without God wanting to get his hands dirty. I mean, Satan as a concept is completely like nonsensical, but any theist that wants to come to me and say in the context of like the Judeo-Christian God that Satan makes sense, you can't.
Yeah.
It won't work.
Hey,
We're
Henny,
on the top of 90 minutes now, so guys, just a quick one here. We've got about half an hour to go, so if you want to start, please, if you want to ask a question, it has to be within the subject. It'll be quite kind of you. But while Dan is going to have a word now, I want to finish with, I think, with an example in the Bible that usually is the best analogy or the best story to examine in terms of suffering. I want to talk about the book of Job and the story of Job, and then see because it has humanity, it has Satan, and it has God in it, and I want to examine it a bit. But Dan, you wanted to have a word?
oh no, I just wanted to ask if you could read Ricky's recent comment about his family, but you're going to get to that later, right?
Oh yeah. Here it
Okay.
is.
Yeah. But in my country, we call it the book of Job, not Job. Job is what you.
Do you know what? I thought you were going to say that. I thought,
Oh, sorry, did I say Job?
you said Job.
yeah, I say
Sorry,
Job as well, mate.
yeah,
I say Job
I
as well.
mispronounced it. I would say usually Job. Yeah. Sorry.
What do you say, John? You say Job or Job?
I say Job because
Job.
because
Well,
because
it doesn't matter.
it's
Who knows?
English.
Who knows what the original sounded like anyway?
Job.
So I think Job is a totally senseless book. That people say there's this great moral value in the book. There is some value in the book of Job as an example of some actually pretty good ancient literature wrestling with a problem. And I think there's value in looking at how human beings back then were trying to deal with all of this. But ultimately, it just comes down to God's powerful and can do what he wants. And especially in I think it's the second chapter, verse 3, after the first torturing, Satan comes to God and God says, look at my poster boy, Job. He still doesn't sin with his lips. He still loves me. And even though you tortured him, he still loves me. And Satan says, well, that's because, you haven't really hurt him that much. And then God admitted to Satan that Satan, even though you caused me to ruin Job's life for no reason, right there, God himself admits for no reason. And that was, to me, that's totally morally, criminally bankrupt. It's like, like if I were to approach some loving family and knock on their door and say, hey, your children really love you, but you know what? If you let me in, I'm a convicted serial rapist and killer. If you let me into the house with your kids, I bet you they'll stop loving you. And so you open the door and you let me in. And then you go outside and look through the window at what I'm doing to your family. And I kill the cat and I drown the dog and I torture and then, so who's the criminal here? Is it the actual Satan himself, or is it the hitman? Is it the person who sent them in to allow this thing to happen? And so God said, go ahead then. God said, fine, go ahead, Satan. You can come on in and do what you want to my servant Job. To me, that's criminal. That's immoral. And right there, it's a self-indictment. God himself even saying, and what if the police came and interviewed the father later and said, why did you do that? And the father says, well, I did that because the devil made me do it. Would that be a good excuse for allowing this evil to happen? So if God were on trial, he would be locked up on the basis of his own self-testimony.
I think that I often talk about someone drowning in a pond, right? And like if you walk past them and you have the ability to pick them out of that pond, right? You pick them out of that pond and you help them. But if you leave them in that pond, but you could have got them out. And I think in law you are somewhat culpable for them drowning, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is what God, except God, for God it's even worse, because God has created the principles of drowning. He's created that pond, he's created that, and he's pushed the person in, right, and then walk past and not help them out, whether it be 240,000 people drowning in a tsunami or whatever situation we want to talk about. God doesn't do this. And then what the theist is left doing is invariably skeptical theism, which is like, there must be a reason that God allows this, but we just either don't know the mind of God or we can't know the mind of God. And it's like the get out of jail free card.
What struck me really hard is this seemingly naivety of that God. First of all, and the immaturity. He's like boasting about Job, his his faith, and he's going to Satan to sort of to brag and show off, and then naively being lured and seduced by Satan to drag him into that sort of bet. I think Christenberg sang a song called Spanish Train that had some lines to do with the with this particular bet. And it to me, it's a very strange display of the maturity of God. But the very end of the story, this is when Job goes to God and say, okay, well, I mean, you killed my sons. By the way, he replaced, and Muslims will actually say, oh, look how wonderful God is. He replaced everything that he's took away from Job. But for the 10 children he killed, he's given him exactly 10. I think he doubled everything else, but the children hasn't been doubled because humans is a human. You cannot really replace them with a double number. As if that Mark or Samantha who died, you can just replace them by another person, and the memory of that other child is just gone. It's fine. You have another 10. And I want to get your opinion as well on that final scene when Job said, have that final meeting with God and said, why? And instead of consoling, the poor man, he goes, where the hell were you when I was creating the universe? Who are you to doubt me?
Well, it's just like the plagues of Egypt. God is saying, I'm powerful. I can do what I want. I want to show you how great I am. By the way, those were adult children. And so supposedly Job's wife had 10 more children after that. She would have been a pretty old woman. But at the very end of the book of Job, there's a telling verse, and it happens more. It happens a number of times through the book where God's actions are actually described as evil. The word evil is used, that word ra in the Old Testament. And at the very end of the book, there's a little scene, I think it's like the third verse before the book ends, where Job's family and friends come to him after the whole story is over, and they comfort Job for the evil that God had done unto him. They admitted that what God was doing was evil, using the very word evil that appears in the book of Genesis. You shouldn't take of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil as moral evil. So the book of Job is indicting God himself as an evil actor.
I just can't believe that in the middle of a live YouTube interview, I'm reading Christenberg lyrics online. So that's weird. Anyway, sorry. I basically agree with you, Dan.
Yeah, it is crazy. Yeah, so can you, Jonathan, tell me then, if you are, what goes inside the mind of the faithful person reading the story? How can you conceive of any goodness or any fair or just in that story?
Well, it's the stories like this to me are just clearly almost like intellectual investigation. You can say this about certain books of the Bible, Ecclesiastes, and also, where I don't think it is. And the problem is when they get canonized, and you see this as so this is God and God did this, then you're in trouble. For me, this is just intellectual investigation and exploration about the idea of God, about the power of God, about ideas of good and evil, about ideas maybe of the devil, and then you write a story about that. But you've got to remember, when people wrote these things down, they weren't expecting this to be canonized into a Bible. No one had the concept of what the Bible was right then. And I think we kind of forget this. We see it as a one big unit, which is written from start to finish by almost by one author. That is, and so therefore the whole thing is a coherent narrative. There you go, job done. There's a book. Go and read that. Whereas actually it's a collection of stuff that a bunch of different people wrote and then were edited and then were spliced together and all that kind of stuff over a long period of time. And this book wouldn't have been designed to have been written to explain the reality of a God necessarily, this God, this particular, especially the Christian God. You know, so I think it's understanding maybe the genres that are going on here and questioning what the motivations are for the authors and understanding it for what actually it really is, not for what maybe Christians or Jews think it is.
As a matter of fact, I believe the Book of Job is academically acknowledged, been written by 2 different authors over 2 different periods of time. So here you go.
Yeah.
They share the royalties.
We've got a question here. Maybe if each of you please have a go from Lena. Lena is a moderator. She is half Syrian, half Spanish. So he helps me with my Arabic moderation when I do my Arabic broadcast. And she's got a question. If God died for our sins, why does a final judgment await us? Or why do we have to go to confess our sins every Sunday?
I guess that's a good question. I was thinking as a preacher that the final judgment was really more like a final accounting. We get to the throne of God. Okay, here's how it all shook out. You're going up or you're going down.
My tuppence on this is the whole thing is fundamentally incoherent if you take into account divine foreknowledge. So my opinion is that divine foreknowledge is the biggest problem for the God concept, the omni-God concept. So divine foreknowledge is future knowledge of all future events. So if you know that, I don't know, 2/3 of people are going to go to hell, let's pick a number out of my backside. So 2/3 of people are going to go to hell, then God creates those people. There's nothing those people can do. God has infallible foreknowledge that they're going to go to hell. There's nothing they can do that can change that. And so that final judgment is actually a preliminary judgment made before creation. So God has like designed them in his head, judged them, and then created them. Then they fail the accounting process that Dan's talking about, which is just a foregone conclusion, literally. And then they go to hell. And that whole, so divine foreknowledge for me, if you believe in A, eternal conscious torment, and B, divine foreknowledge, then God is morally abhorrent. And there is absolutely no excuse.
My answer to this is quite pragmatic, which is it's almost like in a job. You have a final target, but you have KPIs to achieve to get to that target, and you're judged by that performance. And religion is so pragmatic in a way that they understand if you just give a final ending to the story without giving people rituals, because we're creatures of habits, everything will dissolve and will fall away. By giving people chores to do, things to do on daily basis and things to do on weekly basis, it will keep the herd together. You know, these are the things you need to do, and you're going to be completely indulged into what needs to be done on daily and weekly basis, and therefore renew the vows. I remember Dan saying about, you don't hear scientists gathering in a conference and talk about the atom and renewing the vows with their beliefs. But you see the Christians do that and the Muslims do that, because if they don't do that for a while, they might forget what it's all about. What do you reckon, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. The faith is an underlying insecurity there. If you had knowledge, you don't need faith. Faith is an admission that what you're accepting cannot stand on its own merits, and you need something else to go. But to expand on what John just said about divine judgment, I think we can make an analogy to human free will and social judgment. Even if everything is completely deterministic, analogizing to God having perfect foreknowledge, right? We still, in the real world, at the nexus of the person who's committing the action, we still will hold that person morally responsible for their actions, even though they could argue, well, hey, this all happened way back in the Big Bang and I'm coming up to now, so let me go. So some theists might argue that, well, yeah, God had foreknowledge, but still at the end of times, he's going to make that final, not social judgment, but a final divine judgment about how we acted, whether it was deterministic or not. He's going to make that final accounting.
I'd say there's possibly a false analogy there, because in the human context, when we are judging people, even though we understand there's a deterministic like background to that, we don't know about, so we don't have the knowledge, so we look at what they've done and say, right, now we're going to say you're guilty, and we might do that for reasons of deterrence, we might do that for all these kind of things, whereas God would have known in advance, even before creating, or causally before creating, prior to creating. So I think it's a slight difference there in those two cases, and I think it is even more problematic therefore for the God concept.
Yeah, that's right. You're exactly right about that. And so with determinism, it would be the theoretical possibility that we could have worked out the deterministic outcome based on prior situations. But of course, we're not smart enough to do that.
Yeah.
And I know you've got a question there, but I'm interested to see what, if I may be so cheeky, interested to see what Dan has to say about this idea of skeptical theism, the idea that there could be a reason for all this suffering, but we just don't know what the reason is. So there you go. And that allows me to sleep well at night.
Well, isn't that just another word for mystery?
Yeah, God works in mysterious ways. That's classic.
Yeah.
I mean, but it doesn't help the situation, because we are, if you're not just if you're saying, well, there is a wisdom that only can be perceived by God. You are too small to understand it. Who is responsible of that feeble mind, or the mind that is not strong enough or not capable enough to understand the wisdom of God? Yet he wants to have a relationship with us. It makes no sense.
I think it's slightly worse than that still, because actually, and this is a real problem. So the idea that, the analogy I've used in a previous book is that my kid walks on a bunch of, as a toddler, walks on a flower bed and crushes a load of flowers. So I pull them away, I beat them up, and I give them cancer, right? But I don't tell them why I've done that. I don't even say that I don't even connect it to that thing, to the trampling. And so the idea that we have all this evil and suffering in the world, and yet God doesn't connect that to our behaviors, or doesn't connect it to the causal reason at all. It doesn't even come down and tell us. Like, what we'd have to do is we have to assume that there is a reason. So I think that there are two things going on. It's like it's apparently that we can't understand the reason, but we're not even told that there is a reason, really. I mean, you could divine a few bits and pieces from the Bible, but God doesn't come down and clearly say, oh, do you know all that Ebola that happened? You won't understand it, guys. Yeah, I know you're a bit simple, but there is a reason I put Ebola down there.
Considering that punishment sometimes is visited upon people who don't even get to destroy the flowers. They haven't done a thing. Yet something bad happens to them, and that cannot even be explained. Like, they've just absolutely done nothing. Like, good people, apparently, also from the Bible, Bart Ehrman found that, according to the story of Job, that evil can be visited on good people to show patience, the virtue of patience and perseverance. So
yeah, but John's toddler might not have known that it was a bad thing to trample on the flowers.
fair enough. Fair enough. That's a good point. Yeah. They haven't reached yeah.
And and this goes back to all the natural evil we were talking about. Like, you can think about all different ways to get out of this, but like a fawn won't be able to connect anything to it. No kind of greater concept like that. But if it really feels the pain and suffering, then unless that fawn goes to heaven, right, and this gets back to that problem again, unless each of those entities that feel suffering have their accounts balanced, then God is not omni-God.
Yeah, considering as well that we've been created out of nothingness. Like, we haven't even asked to endure this journey. We've been brought here to go through the Hunger Games. This is a Muslim viewer, so he's got a Muslim Islamic twist into his question, and also it's a bit of political as well, because it's got some political analogy. Hi, Hanny, Jonathan, and Dan. My question is: do you think that the reason why Muslims in the Middle East have always gotten along with tyrannical regimes because they believe in an unjust God?
Well, maybe they do go hand in hand. I hadn't thought about that. it would seem like if you are on the one hand comfortable with a God of vengeance and injustice, that would leak over into your political philosophy as well. I don't know. What do you think, John?
Do you think? Sorry, I was replying to someone in the live chat there. Do you think the reason why Muslims in the Middle East have always gotten along with the tyrannical regimes because they believe in an injustice God? The idea that Islam means submission, I think, is always an interesting component of this. You have a very Old Testament version of God, which is, I think, reflected by it being the writings or the thinkings of Muhammad as he moved on in his life, and he became more and more militaristic and therefore interested in a larger and larger set of potential believers, and therefore had to control them, blah blah blah, rather than the beginning of his ministry where it's all kind of love and peace, attracting those early followers in. Once you get to a big sort of critical mass, it all becomes about warring factions, and then he becomes militaristic, so that's reflected in the theology that comes along with that. And then you just get humans, you get a whole spectrum of political psychology in humans, and it's really interesting when you look at the Bible and you look at New Testament lovey-dovey Jesus, sort of Jesus's love, and the Old Testament jealous God, authoritarian, and then you look at people who believe in America, for example, and you will get parenting styles that reflect that, that's reflected by their or caused by their belief in God, or it could be it's their psychological dispositions that actually manifest in the type of God they believe in. So people do a lot of church shopping in America, where the politics of their church don't align themselves to their own politics, so they move to a church that does, and they'll be looking for a church that aligns itself to their political psychology, I would argue their political psychology informs their theology and the type of God they believe in, and then they will go to a place that fulfills that kind of like psychology and belief that I'm starting to ramble.
I'm going to borrow from Christopher Hitchens because he made a point. You see, he was a very, very interested in politics and social affairs and connecting him to religion. And we always been atheists faced with examples of Hitler, North Korea, Potts, Stalin, as here were people were not believing in God, and they were horrible. They've committed horrible stuff. But then Hitchens used to respond to the Stalin situation and taking over from the Tsar and North Korea, that these are very, very religious nations. Because all what they've done is they've taken away God and they put themselves instead. He actually said that in North Korea, it's the Father, they're one short of a Trinity, the Father and the Son, as a joke. And these are these are not societies based on skepticism. Or scientific approach, but what they've done is they've used the reservoir of this nation's readiness to accept dominance and tyranny, and therefore, because of the religious beliefs, their inherent religious beliefs sort of prepare you to accept things like that. Therefore, you'll find we're talked about poorer, ignorant countries. When I say ignorant here, that means scientific education is not prevalent. It also happened to be ruled by dictatorship.
I think we can also point out that atheism is not and has never claimed to be a moral philosophy. Atheism is just the absence of a belief in God. It doesn't follow that if you are or if you become an atheist, you necessarily become a better person. An atheist can be just as psychopathic as a believer.
100% agree. I wrote a massive article some years back about atheism does not equal Pol Pot, Stalin, and so on and so forth, and Hitler. And in fact, it's more like the correlation fallacy, and you have to do an awful lot more work to get. Otherwise, I would be a mass murderer, right? And you would be a mass murderer. But all three of us, like if atheism leads to mass murder, and then you can look at all the religious people who have done the same. The problem that this kind of correlation between Pol Pot and Stalin in particular, not so much Hitler, because there is elements of Catholicism, Christianity, and all sorts wrapped up in Hitler's belief system. But the problem is that these happened in the 21st century or 20th century, and where we had massive technological capabilities to kill people en masse. And had you had that in the Crusades, had you had that in the Spanish Inquisition, had you had that in the with the conquistadors, with the Aztecs, then you would have had a very different situation then. So it's about how much you desire to kill the people that you're against, and what's motivating that desire to kill them. Was it their atheism, or was it something else? I'd say it's probably something else. But it's complex.
Amr is asking, would we ever find out or conceive of anything empirical or analytical that would fix the logical argument from evil? Probably not fixing, but because I don't think there's nothing to be fixed, or put it to bed once and for all.
You can't fix it. Well, it's skeptical theism. Like, all you have to do. So this is possibility ergo probability fallacy. So if it's possible, it is possible. Therefore, it's probable. It's the idea that, well, there could be a reason why there's so much suffering, right? There could be a reason. Therefore, there probably is a reason. Therefore, there is a reason. And you do this sort of jump along, and then suddenly there's a reason, and that's what you. And then you go, oh, there's a reason that happened. There's a reason that happened. And as long as you can say there's a reason, the logical argument. The problem of evil argument cannot work, or cannot do what people, hope it does, and that's why skeptical theism is a really important idea. That's why I was trying to talk about earlier. It's a really important idea to try and undo. Sorry, Dan.
No. I'm not sure I know what Amir is actually asking. Is he asking, would there come a time when we'll stop talking about this, where theists won't need it, or the atheists won't need this argument? If that's what he's asking, I guess that's possible, but what would make that happen? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm with Jonathan here. It can be explained away. So probably the right question would be, how do you explain it away? And I think natural atheism sort of explains it away. But you talked about, Jonathan, the moving from it's possible, therefore it's happened. And it reminds me of the ontological argument for the existence of God, the Anselm situation, that we can conceive of a maximal, a greater power, and therefore there is maximally. I don't know how he's done that jump. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's from logic to existence, and but that's quite a big topic to negotiate.
But we should point out that Bertrand Russell, when he was a young man, very briefly bought into the ontological argument.
Did he?
He said, wow, this makes sense. And then he says he woke up the next morning and said, oh, this is just bad grammar.
Brilliant.
I think so. I think it's just so weak that jump. It's a literally a leap of faith that he's taken to get to. Therefore, it must be true.
I mean, some of these arguments sort of depend on ideas of the possible worlds as well, which isn't necessarily a thing. Like, you talk about, different possible worlds, and exist as a necessary being exists in all possible worlds. It's like, well, the idea of possible worlds it is not actually a conceptual framework that all philosophers agree to. So, like, you have to, in order to get to the ontological argument, you kind of have to accept the idea of the possible worlds.
What about the God of Einstein, the God of Spinoza? And I think that's one of the sages of Maimonides. What about that kind of God? Is he plausible?
This is my mate Rob, who has come on saying, and him and Ray are saying, oh, I'm picking a straw man version of God because we're looking at omni-God. But the problem with this, not exactly what Rob's saying here, but the problem of saying, oh, that's not the kind of God I believe in. Like, I pick omni-God theism because omni-God is the most common version of God. If you go and ask most people who we're arguing against, and B, who are like theistic believers, they will tell you God is all loving, God is all powerful, and God is all knowing, right? There are plenty of other versions of God, and this problem of evil argument, these problem of evil arguments won't apply to those versions of God.
Sure.
It's kind of what we talked. Rob came into this late, so we talked about this a little bit earlier. But look, you will find lots of other versions of God, but we can't come onto a YouTube video. So this does annoy me a little bit because I hear this so often. We can't do a YouTube video for every single iteration of God in conceptual like humanity. So like that would be a 94 million hour video, and YouTube won't allow us to do that. So therefore we're going to pick the most common version of God. At least that's what I'm doing, and Dan can obviously speak for himself here, but like I'm picking that version of God because it's the most common. Anyway, that doesn't answer that question, sorry.
Well, not only is it the most common, it's causing the most harm. It's the one we have to deal with. As when our organization goes to court to fight these incursions of religion and government, we're not battling pantheists or deists or Confucianists in this country. We're battling the right-wing Bible believers. But deism had some weight. You know, many of the America's founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and them, were deists in the sense that theism is a belief in a personal God, and deism is a belief in some impersonal force that created it all, but who left. And Thomas Paine even said, well, he's gone, or whatever it was. There was a creator and it's gone, but now everything's running on its own. It doesn't write books, it doesn't write Bibles, but if you look at the forest, you can see God's book in nature. You know, that's the way they spoke back then. But these were intellectual people before Darwin, before there was a concept of Darwinian explanation for the origin of life. That's kind of how the freethinkers had to think at that time in deistic ways. And if you look at their daily lives, maybe they wouldn't say this, but we could describe those people as practical atheists. They didn't go to church. They didn't contribute money. They didn't pray. They didn't believe in miracles. There was nothing different in their life day to day from that of us atheists. So they were, in a sense, atheistic. If you think of theism as a personal God, they were atheistic. But they thought of this deistic kind of impersonal, the force maybe that started it all. And I think it made sense back then for a group of people to exist who would call themselves deists. I don't think it makes much sense today.
Yeah.
I think it's also, sorry, can I just say, like, when we're talking about the problem of evil, like this video is about the problem of evil, right? The problem of evil is not a problem for those kind of gods.
Yes.
Right. So therefore, we don't need to talk like, yeah, we're not talking about those gods because this is not what the subject is. The subject, if we're going to talk about the problem of evil, right, it only make like it's. I will read you again. I can read you again the definitions of the two problem of evil arguments. So this is the logical problem of evil. If God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. That is the opening Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy premise to the logical problem of evil. Here's the opening premise, the evidential problem of evil as constructed by Rowe. There exists instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. And two, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent blah, blah, blah. So in other words, yes, we can talk about these other gods. Fair enough, and that's very interesting. But if we're doing a video on the problem of evil, those gods, and with all due respect, those gods are entirely irrelevant. They have absolutely the square root of naff all to do with this conversation. So, and sorry, I do get annoyed because this has happened every time. Every time I talk about the omni God, like this comes up.
Missing the point. There are different. If we were talking about the gods of the Eastern religion, so this problem isn't there because of the reincarnation and other bits and pieces. But we'll probably use a different type of problem to face these type of gods. But today's problem. But one of the things that's been said here, well, Judaism, this is the human perception here. The real Judaism before the First Temple did not talk about an omni God. That God wasn't as perfect as what it's made to be in the latter versions of Judaism. Therefore, true Judaism, Orthodox, the one that is connected to the real faith of Judaism, should not be criticized under this particular analogy.
So I have to go, Hanny. I'm just about out of time here.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Dan. Really enjoyed your intervention today.
This is great. This is stimulating talking with you, smart people.
Thanks very much. Same here.
Thank you, Dan. Dan, you're such a legend, a lovely human being, and I thank you publicly again for writing the foreword to this book.
And we need to get you on our radio show one of these days somehow. Your schedule is so busy, John.
It is insanely busy, but yeah, I have got a free day in December, so I'll hit you with
a free day in December. Okay, let's do that. Bye, guys.
Cheers, Dan.
See you then.
I just went to get this book because when you're talking about the early God of Judaism, of course, this is kind of stuff that Francesca Stavrakopoulou talks about in a book, which is to say that this is the version of God as expressed in early, Israel, whatever you want to call it, Hebrew, early Judaism. This is that kind of God. And then as we've gone on through Christianity to where we are now, we've abstracted that God to this omni God up here, this more abstract idea. And of course, you've got an evolution of the idea of God through those times, from a very corporeal, material existence as something that comes and walks among us and appears among us, to this thing that is behind the universe and doesn't ever sort of appear anymore in that kind of human way.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's pretty evident that we're talking about a certain type of God, guys. It's but he's saying even pantheism still does not exclude the omni categories. So you can be a pantheist and still believe in an omnibenevolent God. And if this is the case, then I'm afraid then we're going to have to apply what exactly we talked about.
Yeah, well, I would need that kind of God to be very carefully defined, because if God has the omni characteristics, then we're back to this video is entirely relevant, and what we've said is entirely still.
And as you said, that agnosticism rings really sound and true every time I hear the definitions of God, because it looks like theists themselves. It doesn't matter which religion or which philosophy you believe in terms of theology. They seem to be differing from one another about the definition of God themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and as with any kind of philosophical chat, you obviously have to define your terms initially, and yeah, that's super important. Yeah.
I'm not sure what is everybody. So Eastern religions don't create injustice. Digging your hole deeper. Where did we ever say that? We said Eastern religions don't have the problem of evil, but they have problems of their own, a reincarnation, and the caste system in India, for example, which is a result of reincarnation. Of course, it causes a problem, but that's a different conversation. Did we say that other religions, therefore, might be true then because they don't have the answers to the problem of evil? They have their own issues.
Yeah, I mean, it depends whether whichever Eastern religion Ray is talking about here has, what does the God of that religion, what characteristics do they have in terms of knowledge, power, and love? So, is it that the God is omnibenevolent and omnipotent, but just doesn't have the full knowledge, or lacking in one or other of these traits? So there you go.
Yeah, I think people conflating agnosticism with agnosticism. So I'm putting the term here for you guys. This is what we're talking about. This is the notion that there is no point of entertaining the idea of God because it's ill-defined. It's not very well defined anyway. So there's no point of talking about something that is not well defined.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess so. Just before, I'm going to have to shoot in a second, but just what I was going to say. I mean, you were talking about. Well, you say what your issue was with regard to the emotional aspect of the problem of evil.
Oh yes, when we were talking offline, that sometimes the theists would say, "Well, what the atheists are whinging about here, it's all emotional. You're people being hurt. It's all to do with it. It's an emotional appeal to what seems to be not a problem at all. This is a natural. This is God's way of dealing with the issues of free will and character building and everything else. And it seems that the atheist, who's supposed to be a logical, skeptic thinker, is appealing to emotions here.
Well, and as we've shown that there are logical syllogisms that you can create for the two different concepts of the problem of evil arguments, but also I would say that yes, it is emotive, and that is actually one of the strengths of this argument in terms of atheology. So why this is such a persistent thorn in the side of say, well, let's call it omnigod theism, is because it does have that emotive power, and it speaks to us. We've all experienced suffering, or we've seen suffering. We can turn on the news and look at the war in Ukraine. We can turn on the news and look at people starving around the world. We can turn on the news and look at plate tectonics ravaging entire communities or countries. And so therefore an argument that takes into account all of these things that affect our lives becomes a very emotionally powerful argument. And that's not to say that it doesn't have logical or rational purchase as well. It's just that we can talk. So the ontological argument, or I don't know, think of some other atheological argument about, I don't know, argument from one of Paul Draper's arguments, maybe a teleological argument, and you're thinking, okay, yeah, but that doesn't, like, I don't experience that on a daily basis. I don't see that, and it doesn't make my blood boil, right? And so that's the power of the problem of evil argument. It is both rationally very strong, at least probabilistically, as far as I'm concerned, and also emotionally very strong. And
so it's an intellectual problem started that way, but it's further strengthened by the fact that we all go through it on a daily basis. Yeah, fair enough. I completely agree. Well, thank you so much. We've just over 2 hours, and this was a wonderful conversation. I'm sure that we will do something, and maybe we'll take the divine hedonist next time.
It's interesting that actually when Dan said the Lisbon thing, and I'm really interested to look into that Lisbon scenario, but that was also an example of divine hiddenness, which is these people were praying, and God, you would expect God to be there to support them, to be with them, but God was hidden and just allowed these natural phenomena to just destroy them, the most fervent of believers, supposedly, if you were in that belief system. So these most chosen, or these most fervent believers, God was absent in their lives to the point that they died.
Yeah, some of the people that they actually misunderstood because they sort of came halfway and they might have thought they were talking about. So glad we
don't worry, Rob and I will be arguing about this down the pub within a week. So
that's brilliant.
He lives around the corner from me, and this is basically. So I'm a tippling philosopher. Actually, that's really down to Rob. So Rob started off this group called the Tippling Philosophers, where we used to meet once a month to discuss things like the problem of evil, and we'd sit around a round table and we'd argue to hell about it. Obviously, we got older and we got families now, so the meeting is much more difficult. And during the pandemic, we met through Zoom. But he lives around the corner, so we will go down the pub and we will argue with each other. That is a guarantee. I love it, so it's not a problem.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I've always enjoyed the discussions with you, and thank you, folks. I think the next conversation we're going to be having is going to be to do with we've got Michael Shermer to discuss his new book, and I've got Gutsy Gibbon to talk about evolution coming soon as well your way. Thanks very much for tuning in, and thanks to my guests Dan Barker and Jonathan MS Pearce. Have a good one.
Thank you so much.